All right, we are recording now, I think, and I'm going to go over to sharing my screen. Share my screen. Going over to the psych thing. And there we go, share. All right, so we're gonna try to finish off this lecture today. So let me get straight to it. All right, so the last two portions of this lecture are basically just highlighting that the benefits and costs of sociality are diverse. They can occur in lots of currencies. They sum together to determine the net benefit or cost of sociality, which determines whether or not a social trait will spread or whether or not an enhanced degree of sociality, if it's a continuous variable, will spread. So thinking about it in both in discrete terms, social, asocial, or if it's continuously distributed, an incremental increase in overall sociability, like the amount that you'll tolerate conspecifics, members of your species and things like that. And then lastly, we'll talk about some common hurdles to the evolution of sociality and altruism that all instances of the evolution of sociality have to contend with. I'm positioning myself where I'm going to, having technical difficulty. I'm old. All right, so natural selection is efficient, which means basically that even very small differences in the reproductive output of different strategies quickly result in the favored strategy proliferating to fixation, i.e. where it is the only strategy that is around. Or if it's a continuous strategy, it will evolve to the point to which it's optimized and then cease directional selection. So even a 5%, a 1%, a 2% benefit of one strategy, say enhanced sociality relative to a more aggressive ancestor, should result in a number of generations where every single individual in that population now exhibits that enhanced level of sociality, that strategy, that favored trait. And it happens even faster if the advantage is larger. So it is a reasonable question to ask that why should there be any variation in a trait in a population that is linked to fitness, because evolutionary biology, basic evolutionary theory, supposes that such variation should disappear quickly. There should be an optimal trait. We should reach it fast. We should fix to that trait. There should be no other variability, and that should be the end of it. Yet we see lots of variation in almost any trait you can imagine, and so it leaves evolutionary biologists to ponder how that variation got there. Anyway, the point of this is just to convey that even small differences in fitness linked to your strategy should result in your strategy being the only strategy in a small number of generations, within a few hundred generations for certain. All right, so selection, although being in a social group could mean that you have advantages to anti-predator behavior or anti-parasites or enhanced detection of food or whatever, or then there are probably very many costs as well, natural selection only sees the net outcome of all of those things. All the costs, all the benefits sort of get in economical terms summed together, and if the net outcome is beneficial to be in a social group or to be in a larger social group or to have a more tightly knit social group or whatever relative to a more or less social ancestor, then that new trait should increase in frequency and severity. All right, so let's go over some of the common costs and benefits of sociality real quickly. So predator detection, avoidance, and eviction. If you're living in a group, you are not the only one scanning the skies or scanning the ground or scanning the leaf litter for predators that might ambush you. So you have a probability of detecting your predator, but there's a chance you'll fail. But if there are 20 of you, the odds that all of you are going to fail to detect your predator are pretty remote. Which means you're more likely to detect a predator, you're more likely to detect it sooner, you're more likely to be able to chase it off in some instances. If you have a chance of coordinating together to chase off your predator, you might be able to do that. You could mob your predator like some birds do. And then there are special instances like murmuration, not really murmuration in birds, but certainly schooling behavior in fish, where being in a school allows you to basically transmit information about the location of that predator, even if you can't see it directly. So even though you're on one fish on one side of the school, you can tell based on the orientation of the other fish where the predator is likely to be, even if you can't see it. So it's sort of like a swarm detection, many sensors, and hive detection sort of phenomenon. It's neat. Parasite removal, it can be hard to pick off your own parasites, to groom yourself and take care of your body. And having somebody else to assist you to check for ticks can be advantageous. And that's not just, in human terms while we're camping, but all over the animal kingdom. Preening young, preening infecting colony mates, grooming, allo-grooming is a common social benefit of living in a society that is oftentimes co-opted as a signal to reinforce bonds even when parasites aren't there. So like primates will actually pick at each other's hair, even when there's not that many parasites involved, because they've evolved to feel that as pleasurable, and it helps to reinforce social bonds even in the absence of parasites. So these sorts of mechanisms can be co-opted as general cues subsequently by evolution. Foraging efficiency. By working in a group, you're going to be able to do stuff in terms of foraging that a singleton individual cannot do. Like our African painted dog example from earlier, or Pride of Lions, they're able to exhaust prey, execute coordinated maneuvers, detect prey more easily as a consequence of working in a group. And even if you don't even get that much of that food, the fact that somebody in your group is catching prey pretty regularly means that you're less likely to have days where you're starving. Anyway, so these bark beetles in the top portion here are supposed to, basically they attack trees in unison. If only a small number of bark beetles attack these trees have basically an immune defense that can prevent the beetles from overwhelming their defenses, and it basically kills off the infection of the beetles. But if lots of the beetles work in concert to overwhelm the tree's natural defenses, then basically the tree shuts down, and the marauding bark beetles consume the tree and kill it. The orcas here use pod tactics to subdue prey that are otherwise unobtainable. And so this is waving behavior. You can go YouTube waving behavior if you like. Basically, the pod will see some sort of prey item on an ice float, like this poor crab-eater seal. It looks like a crab-eater seal, but who knows what kind of seal it is. Anyway, let's pretend it's a crab-eater seal. Anyway, so these pods of orcas will basically align in unison, swim all together, and then right before they get to the float, where the little, pretend you're the crab-eater seal, right before they get to you, they then go right underwater and pass just beneath the ice float that you're protected yourself on. Anyway, so this produces a wave of water that splashes over the icy surface that you are residing on, Mr. Crab-eater seal, to protect yourself. The problem is that water has inertia, and it will cascade and tend to slide you off the back end of that float that you're residing on, thinking you're all smug and well protected. The pod will do this over and over and over, and this increases the odds that one of these waves knocks the crab-eater seal off the back of the float, where other members of the pod are likely to ambush it and lie in wait. Social foraging and these gray wolves here, same issue here. Actually, even sponges work in unison by having little collar cells with flagella that spin, that allow a huge amount of water to pass over the sponge and out the top of the sponge. That basically allows the filter feeding strategy that sponges have not to be something other than a passive strategy. By working in unison, they can make a current that forces water through the sides of the sponge where it's filtered for organic molecules, and the water shot out the top of the sponge. And so they can move lots and lots of water, and all those choanocytes obtain more organic molecules for food because they're working in unison to create that pump that otherwise a singleton choanocyte, a single collar cell with a single flagella, is not going to be able to make a giant current. It's not going to catch that much food, and it would have to rely on the movement of water currents across the surface of the ocean in order to get all of its food, which would be much less food than if it could make its own current. And in order to make its own current, it's got to work in concert. Mate attraction. Sometimes you need to work in concert with other individuals to acquire a mate. These red-capped birds in the top here are lance-winged or lance-tailed manakins. Anyway, so in this case, males do a little leapfrog dance. They work in a group of males between 2 and 3 to impress females using a combined dance. That's much more likely to lure females into mating with one or both of the males. So they use it to impress the girl. This little, I guess these are 4 male lions here. Groups of younger male lions will work in concert to extirpate a pinnacle, older, better conditioned male from an existing pride. So a triad of small males or a pair of small males, oftentimes that are brothers, will force out an existing male that would be able to defeat any one of those brothers. But because those brothers are working in concert, they can force out the existing dominant male, and then those brothers can share the reproductive access to the lionesses in the pride. So by working in concert, they can assume a mating role in a pride much earlier in life than they would otherwise be able to obtain. And then lastly, as a sort of a violent example, but it is worth bearing in mind, these mallard ducks, by working in groups, these inferior low quality males that can't find a female to mate with them and pair off, will work in concert to try to force copulation on females. Abiotic tolerances. Sometimes animals live in really harsh environments, and the only way that they're able to endure those sorts of environments is by working in concert. So of the four Antarctic species of penguin that occur on mainland Antarctica, most of the species engage in allo-huddling behavior in order to endure cold winters. So the penguins all huddle together in a giant mass, which reduces the surface area to volume ratio, which allows most of the members to have to reside in the protected center of conspecifics, so they're protected from those icy winds. And then even the individuals that are on the outside, it's only a small portion of their body that's exposed to the cold winter. And by working in a group, they can all huddle together and maintain enough body temperature and protection from chilling, shearing winds to be able to allow them to persist on the mainland of Antarctica, where if it was a singleton penguin, he or she would freeze to death. There's a romantic story that penguins take turns on the outsides of these huddles. That actually turns out not to be true. They just sort of like shuffle around, and so it's just because they're kind of bustling. People thought that they were, taking turns. It's not. Some individuals are just screwed into being on the outside perpetually, and other individuals are constantly enjoying their interior position of the group, and that's just them's the breaks, eh? All right, so these nasty looking combination of webs in the bottom right hand side here are social spiders from Amazonia and Ecuador, and they occur in lowland rainforests where not only does it rain, but it has torrential rain. And if you have torrential rain all the time and you rely on a silken trap to capture your prey, that's bad for you. Why? Because every time it rains, it messes up your web. And if it's messing up your web all the time, then it's not a very effective trap, and you're spending a lot of your time and energy recreating that silken structure. So social spiders are able to endure these really high-level torrential rain environments, precipitation environments of lowland East Ecuador and Amazonia by basically sharing the cost of having to repair that web. By having many individuals that contribute to sustaining a web together, they're not always in caloric deficit. If it was a single spider trying to repair its web all the time and get whatever food it possibly could, it just couldn't get enough prey to even persist there. It would perish. It would be in caloric deficit. More efficient movement. So you might be able to draft behind the movement of fellow members, like in this fellow flock members, like in these geese here. Or you might use conspecifics to create superstructures like bridges, like these ants have here, that allow you to bridge adjoining portions of foliage that would otherwise cause ants to walk down the first tree, walk up the second tree, and go up to the next leaf. But if the leaves are not that far apart in the canopy, then things like superstructures like bridges can allow those ants to just move from one leaf to the next. They don't have to go all the way down one tree and all the way back up the next one. They create a shortcut of a living architecture of ants. And then they can also individuals can learn migratory routes as well. Territory defense. So if you live in a saturated environment where nice sites are rare, then working in concert with fellow members of your species can help you to secure nicer spots and nicer territories, higher quality territories, and to defend them from intrusion. Cooperative breeding cichlids are able to defend superior territories in these piles of rocks where they can lay their eggs that have greater anti-predator benefits, and by working in a group, they can defend these territories from intrusion by other members of their species. If a singleton cichlid was trying to do it on its own, it would have a low odds of being able to defend its territory. By working in a group, it's much more likely to be able to defend that territory effectively. Synalpheus, snapping shrimp in the bottom right-hand corner here, are eusocial shrimp that have defender individuals and reproductive individuals, and they live in an environment where every single sponge on the reef has some kind of snapping shrimp. There are pair-bonded snapping shrimp, and then which only have a female and a male, and then there are communal social shrimp, which live in multi-individual groups. And then there are eusocial snapping shrimp, which have specialized defender castes. And the paired species, that only have a male and a female, have basically no odds of invading a sponge that is occupied by a communal species, which has many individuals coordinating together to defend a sponge from intrusion. But those communal species, which have males and females, they live in multi-female, multi-male groups, but they don't have specialized defender castes, those have a hard time, those species have a hard time invading the sponges that are occupied by eusocial snapping shrimp, which have specialized defender individuals that are not reproductive, that their only job in life is to defend this sponge from intrusion by other kinds of snapping shrimp that might try to invade and steal the resource. So in these conditions, not only does it pay to be in a group living species, but it pays when you're defending this high quality resource like a sponge for you to have specialized defensive castes, i.e. be eusocial, where there's a division of labor, where there's a reproductive caste and a non-reproductive caste, in this case, a defender caste. Make sense? I think I covered everything there. Listen to that twice just in case. It's a lot of content. Oh, just a surprise category. All right, and then parental care. Rearing babies is hard. So if you can acquire the assistance of others to help you rear your offspring, then that cost of rearing your young is then distributed across many individuals, and many hands make light work, right? So meerkat societies, there's usually just a single reproductive female, and then many non-reproductive females that help, and males that help her rear her offspring. And they often have these social cooperative breeding species that assist one or a few breeders, and there's individuals that forego breeding for whatever reasons. They oftentimes live in environments that are particularly harsh, and so it's very difficult to rear offspring on their own. And these individuals, if they tried to leave these groups and set out and have their own reproductive colony, they'd be very likely to fail. And so they obtain, the helpers obtain some benefit by staying in these units and assisting usually their relatives in rearing offspring that they're at least somewhat related to. And then the reproductives naturally have the costs of parental care distributed across many individuals, and so of course it's advantageous for them. There are cooperative breeding birds, there are cooperative breeding mammals, there are cooperative breeding cichlid fish that are studied here at McMaster University. But then it's thought that cooperative breeding is the evolutionary antecedent, i.e. the precursor of things like eusocial insect societies, where basically you have one mother who reproduces, she produces lots of offspring, and those offspring, they don't leave, they just stay with their mothers and help them rear their sisters for many, many generations. So you can think of most eusocial insect societies like ants and honeybees as being really highfalutin, really fancy cooperative breeders, where there's one or a few reproductive individuals, many individuals that assist, and then in many of these societies, there are special castes within that helping class that allows them to be particularly efficient at their jobs, like enlarged mandibles and defense. But there are costs, right? It's not all benefits to being social, because otherwise every organism on Earth would be living in highly integrated societies with division of labor and blah, 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 blah. Humans like to really exalt the benefits of sociality because we're social and it's advantageous in our world, so it sort of taints how we view the world. But the fact of the matter is that lots of species could evolve higher levels of sociality. They're not prevented from doing so by some law of physics, but they don't because it's not profitable. It's actually better. It's advantageous for many species to exhibit lower levels of sociality with less highly integrated social structures. So living in a group one can make you more conspicuous to predators. If a predator's trying to find you, smell you, see you, hear you, and you're on your own, presumably you're making less racket, you're producing less smell, and you're just harder to detect remotely. But if there's a crap load of you all together, you know, squawking at each other or urinating and defecating all over the place or fighting with each other and putting blood in the water or whatever, then this allows predators that are on the lookout for prey to be able to detect social prey in large aggregations more easily. In fact, there are some extreme circumstances like baleen whales where a baleen whale can't even detect a krill remotely. One krill. But if the krill reach a critical size in terms of their group size, they can be detected by the remote echolocation of these baleen whales. So living in a large group of these krill gets them killed. They're suddenly visible to their dominant predators and are much more likely to be detected and consumed. Disease spread. Being social with each other, being nice with each other means that you're getting close to other individuals who might have infections. And in social animals, many kinds of diseases have evolved the ability, infections have evolved the ability to be transmitted by social infections. So like these two cats in the bottom side here are having an affiliative interaction where they're sort of like grooming each other and rubbing their noses on each other. But if one of these two cats has something like feline leukemia, then it's much more likely to transmit that to this other cat. So let's imagine this scuzzy, cream-colored cat on the left-hand side here has feline leukemia. If it goes around rubbing its nose with all these other male cats or female cats in the neighborhood, then like the probability of having feline leukemia transmitted is greatly enhanced. Now imagine that we were in a neighborhood of cats where they all hated each other, right? And no other cat wanted to be anywhere near every other cat. Well, if feline leukemia is predominantly transmitted via social interactions, then the transmission probability and the incidence of the disease overall would be lower in less social populations of these cats or neighborhoods of these cats. Increased competition for food, mates, and space. The organism on Earth that shares the most needs in common with you, i.e. has the greatest potential to compete with you for stuff you want, are members of your species. They have the same dietary requirements. They oftentimes are seeking the same mates, the same preferred territories. I guess I hit all three. And same food. And so having a cluster of you in the same area means that you're going to have to compete with each other for food, for mates, for space. And so that increases competition. So imagine you're these ant lions on the right-hand side here, which are larval insects that produce little pits that ants crawl into. They fall down to the bottom, and then this little larval insect that looks like a little sandworm type thing basically hooks the ant and drags it into the abyss and then consumes it, probably slowly and miserably for the ant. Anyway, you produce a little sand trap as a ant lion. Great. Cool. Now, what if you're surrounded, like one of these interior ant lions, by other traps? Well, now, in order for an ant to actually get to your trap, it's going to have to meander around in a very particular and sinusoidal type way in order to get to your trap, which means you basically have shadows of other individuals preventing prey from getting to your trap, and that is costly. Same thing would happen if we had spider webs all together. If you're a spider web that's on the interior of a giant mass of spider webs, the odds of a prey getting to you, my friend, real low. All right, same thing happens with things like preferred spots on rock heads with anemones. They'll detect each other, they'll fight with each other. Oftentimes one attacks the other one, and then they even produce specialized tentacles to fight each other in many species of anemone. And that is a costly interaction because they aggregate together, many species of anemones, in these colonies. They experience more local direct competition. And then mates. If you're living with a bunch of other individuals of your species and you leave your female or male alone, let me tell you, the odds of other individuals trying to bogard them while you're away are dramatically enhanced. And you're less likely to detect it because, one, rivals for mates are right there. Two, there's a sea of other conspecifics nearby that probably obscure your ability to detect even when your partner vanishes for a little while, or even mates at the nest or at your home together. So having lots of competitors for mates in the immediate vicinity basically creates opportunities for cuckoldry that are not advantageous for any focal pair of individuals. You don't want this. If you are a medium quality male, you do not want to be in a high competition environment because odds are there's going to be some other male that looks more virile or has higher quality genes than you that could become a disadvantageous interloper in your life. All right. Increased probability of exploitation, theft, cuckoldry, and physical damage. So I already mentioned cuckoldry, but like just imagine we're flying together in a flock. There's just a small probability that while we're flying, I'm gonna clip you, or you're gonna clip me. And it's totally accidental, but now we're tumbling from the sky and trying to right ourselves, right? Or if we're all living together and I'm caching my food like a scrub jay, or I'm trying to eat various kinds of fruit like this golden lion tamarin, well, there's a chance that if I'm distracted for a second, you'll steal my food and run away. If we weren't living in a group and I didn't pay attention to my fruit for a second, I could turn right back and it'd probably still be there. But if I'm in a giant social group and I do not attend to a high quality resource all the time, there are constantly other individuals that are looking to steal your lunch or dinner or mate. et cetera, et cetera. Physical damage. So these Adelie penguins here. Oh, these are macaroni penguins. Sorry, the little like yellow eyebrow individuals. Anyway, species. So I think they're macaroni penguins. Anyway, so macaroni penguins, when they breed together on these like rocky islands in the southern hemisphere, they reach such alarming densities that individuals that go out to eat to bring back food to their young are basically crawling all over masses of individuals of their species. And every time that they're trying to they're just trying to get back to their nest to feed their young, they're assaulted by every other pair of individuals trying to reproduce on this environment. So they basically have to go through a marauding mass of reproductive conspecifics that are just ripping them apart or attacking them as they're just trying to get home to feed their young. So if the colonies were just a little bit less dense, it would be easier to be able to move around these landmines. But you can go look up YouTube videos of these macaroni penguins. When their colonies reach alarming densities, you feel bad for them. It's a hard life. One trip to the ocean, get assaulted 50 times coming home, just to vomit up your food, to be consumed by your ungrateful offspring. And you have to do this not just once, but over and over and over and over and over. Completely thankless. No, thank you. All right. Costs and benefits act simultaneously. So there are costs, there are benefits. They're being acquired while you're living in these colonies. And if the net outcome of all of these accountings of costs and benefits result in a positive outcome of being social or more eusocial or whatever, then those traits will tend to proliferate. And the costs and benefits also vary based on the degree of sociality. So it's not just whether you're social or not, but how big is your group, how elaborate is your social structure, et cetera, et cetera. So the costs and benefits also change with group size. And that's interesting because that means that for many kinds of groups, there will be an optimal group size, 20 individuals, 30 individuals, where the benefits are maximized and the costs are minimized. So we're going to talk with a golden fish example for just a second here. And on the x-axis here of all of these figures will be the flock size, which will generally be between 0, 6, \7, but then for one of our response variables, they'll allow much larger flock sizes, but they don't highlight that. Golden finches. All right, so head jerks. So while golden finches are eating seeds on the ground, every so often they just jerk their head up to scan the sky just briefly to see if a predatory bird is nearby trying to eat them. All right, so when you're a singleton individual, you're the only pair of eyes that you have scanning the sky. So if you're by yourself, you're jerking your head up relatively regularly to scan that sky. Versus as you get larger and larger flock sizes, the per capita individual head jerk per minute goes way down. And that's because you know that there are other individuals around you that are occasionally checking the sky. So that means that you don't have to be the only pair of eyes any longer. There are other individuals looking out for predators for you. And if they suddenly fly away, frightened, then that provides you rather direct evidence that maybe you should do that too. All right. However, despite the fact that each finch in that flock is just spending a tiny little amount of its time now scanning the sky, in aggregate in larger flocks, there are more eyes scanning the sky. So although each individual is doing less work scanning the sky for predators and spending most of its time eating now, hooray, which is what they're there for, they're trying to eat as much as possible, it means that even though each individual is doing this head jerk less, that the group in aggregate is spending more time scanning the sky, which means it's going to be hard for a predator to sneak up on them. Many hands make light work. This is a weird thing that it's hard to tell whether or not this is a cost or a benefit. I think it's a cost. Anyway, so as you get to larger and larger flock sizes, the amount of time that an individual spends eating a seed goes down. It's hard to imagine why you would be a more efficient seed husker when you're surrounded by other individuals in the flock that are consuming seeds as well. It's not like you see them and you see their technique and you learn their technique and it's transmitted. There's no evidence of any of that, but it's probably more has to do with competition. So because there's only so many seeds around and there's a bunch of you trying to eat these seeds at once, you're trying to eat as many as possible, as quickly as possible, because if you don't, there are other hungry hippos that will get all of the seeds. There's a lot of metaphors in that. Is that clear? Because there are lots of other individuals around, you need to eat quickly, or there will soon be no food for you. It's a cost. And then lastly, this is definitely a cost, because there's a crap load of you now in larger flock sizes. That means that when you discover a windfall of seeds, you all descend upon the seeds together and you share them and you eat them quickly. The problem, because you're competing with each other, the problem with this is that you're going to deplete those seeds eventually. And because there's a bunch of you in larger groups, you're going to deplete that food more quickly, those seeds more quickly, which means you have to spend more of your time trying to find another windfall of seeds for the group. And that means that's more time moving between patches. That means you're not eating during that time and you are expending calories, which is bad for you. So all of this integrates together, these costs and benefits. And so, oh God, this is completely ugly here. I am so sorry. Anyway, the benefits of a group will have some sort of curve that that is linked to group size. It's oftentimes highly nonlinear, right? So it decrescendos here. The costs of a group also will change with group size in some way. Whenever the benefits, i.e. this top line here, intercept the costs, that is the moment where it no longer pays to even be in a group, right? It would be neutral. Individuals that reside on this red star here, groups of that size, an individual has no benefit of being in that group. It could just as easily go it alone, right? Because it would be in a group that's so large that the benefits are now equivalent to the costs. If, however, an individual tried to enter a group that was larger than that red star, further down on that x-axis, now the cost would be even greater than the benefits, in which case that individual should not join such a group because it would have better chances and better outcomes going it alone. But group size is smaller than that 14, 15, 16 red dot here, so red star here, sort of outcome are still more advantageous. The benefits are greater than the costs for those group sizes. So if you're just a bird flying around, even if a group is, say, 10 or 11 birds, which is beyond the optimal group size, but your only choice is to either join that group of 10 and make a group of 11 or go it alone, it pays for you to join that overly large group because at least for you still, it pays to be added to that group. Even though it hurts all the other group members just a little bit, the net performance or the per capita performance of that group will be suppressed a little bit. The benefit is still better for you to join that suboptimal group than to go it alone. And that will continue to be the case until you reach this critical point where the benefits and costs intercept each other. Where do natural groups fall? So here we have this nice optimal group size of like 5 or 6 individuals, right? The most perfect group size. Do normal social groups reach those optimal group sizes? No, because other individuals that are going it alone out there in the environment will see this group, our optimal group, our Eden, and they'll come and they'll invade it. They'll just join. And there's very little that we can normally do to stop them. So they just keep adding to our group. And we can't force them out under most circumstances. And so we just reach a larger and larger group size until the moment where it no longer really pays for new individuals to join our group because our group is so overburdened that we're now of equivalent performance as individuals going it alone, in which under those conditions, individuals will tend to leave our group, new members will tend not to join our group, and that means that the normal group size that groups have exceeds their optimal group size. So it's some sort of intermediate between the optimal group size and the moment when there's equivalent performance for singleton individuals and group members. So like in this red dot here, there would be a horizontal line where individuals will no longer join that group, because the costs now outweigh the benefits. All right, what are the special features that prevent the evolution of social phenotypes? Like why is natural selection so inefficient in social taxa relative to panmictic asocial taxa? One, there's usually population structure. So if you are living in a social species, groups of your species tend to occur in family units, in local neighborhoods of familiar individuals, and then they have in-groups and out-groups. We have everyone in our group, and there's everybody else. You tend to mix and mate with individuals within your group or neighborhood of groups. There are oftentimes reduced immigration and emigration events. Individuals moving between groups are usually rarer. And so that means that if there's an adaptation, say a wonderful adaptation occurs in one of these blue groups, in the bottom right-hand corner here in this social network. Well, the nice thing is that within that blue group, if that's a neighborhood where lots of individuals tend to mate and move around, and there's some familiarity between adjacent groups, well then locally, those adaptations will tend to spread within those groups. But the probability of that adaptation in that blue region, among those blue groups, the odds of it getting over to something like the yellow groups are quite low, because it might be only every generation, a small number of individuals that move from one category of groups or neighborhood of groups to another, which means that adaptations could be temporarily trapped in subpopulations or some social groups and prevented from spreading to others. So versus if this was a total panmictic population where individuals are not integrated into little societies, then the odds of that adaptation being able to spread through the whole population more quickly are enhanced. But because there are societies, there's in-group and out-group morality, there's in-group and out-group aggression, in-group and out-group altruism and pro-sociality that will prevent the spread of advantageous adaptations to the population as quickly as if there had been no level of sociality. Also, if we're tightly linked together in these little subgroups together, and we all nestle together in the environment, this means that if something bad happens to one of us, odds are bad things are going to happen to all of us, or many of us. And that means that things like genetic drift or chance events are much more influential in our local neighborhood, because the effective population size that we live in is much smaller than the actual population size, because we reside in these little neighborhoods where things like chance events and noise will be more influential, which means things like natural selection are, by contrast, less influential. So drift becomes more affluent in highly subdivided, highly structured populations, and social populations tend to have such structures. Bad things happen, they tend to happen in groups. Chance events, things that happen, tend to be more influential in smaller subgroups, and social populations have such structures. I hope that's clear. Incipient sociality is hard to do on your own. Let's imagine a world where we are tadpoles, and we are generally not very nice to each other. Sometimes we even cannibalize each other. And you are the first tadpole in generations to have a macro mutation that means you mean to cooperate with other members of your species. Congratulations, a star is born. Problem, nobody else in this population is likely to have that mutation, which means while you're going around trying to coordinate some sort of social structure with other members of your species, they still possess that aggressive, selfish, even cannibalistic ancestral trait, and so you're very likely to get picked off. You well-meaning, pro-social, altruistic, cooperative anomaly. What a great idea. Usually picked off by one of its conspecifics, because it doesn't reside in a social landscape where it has other members of its species to cooperate. It might be advantageous for your cooperative tendency to spread through this population. It might be great for everyone involved, but because you don't have the right milieu of other social traits around you, you can't spread. So this is a phenomenon called positive frequency dependence. Positive frequency dependence means that the more common a trait is in a population, the better it does. And sociality is a great example of this. The odds of the social phenotype paying off are increased when there are lots of other social members around you. So the more common sociality, cooperation is in your immediate vicinity, the more advantageous your trait will tend to be, at least hypothetically. It's positive frequency dependent to a point, and certainly it's better to have many of you than just one. Sociality also offers another tier that could be exploited. Every tier of biological organization has something that evolves to exploit it, to screw it up. Right? So transposable elements or viruses within genomes will copy themselves over and over and over, all over the genome, basically cheating normal Mendelian inheritance and creating additional copies of themselves all through these genomes. And this can cause things like cancers to form. Tissues and organs oftentimes have rogue cell lineages that can spread throughout the organism, like cancer. Or in some cases, there could be socially transmitted cancers, which have been detected in things like Tasmanian devils and some mice that Cancers can spread from individual to individual. The fact that we have tissues and organs creates a gateway for things like multicellular anomalies like cancers to proliferate and be a meaningful strategy. The fact that genes are integrated together in genomes allow things like rogue genes, like transposable elements or viruses, to flip precursors to viruses to copy themselves through the genome and exploit that tentative cooperation that normally occurs between different genes in the same genome. When you get to a whole society, now we're all integrated into many individuals working together in concert, like ant colony or a bunch of cooperative breeders or whatever. This means that while we're all working towards some shared goal or have some set of currencies that we're exchanging, this opens the door for social parasites, i.e. members of our species or closely related species, to intercept our pro-social behavior and reap the benefits of being in our group without paying the costs. Or they might directly exploit us. They might be eating our young, but because we've evolved high levels of sociality, we might have a hard time detecting them, friend from foe, in-group versus out-group. Which brings us to an interesting macro pattern called Emery's rule. Emery's rule is the idea that a very highly social species, oftentimes they have social parasites that have evolved to infiltrate their societies and steal their resources, and this most commonly, this social parasite, if it's a different species, will tend to be a very closely related species to the social species itself. Why should that be? Why should the parasite that has evolved to take advantage of you tend to be closely related to you taxonomically over evolutionary time? Well, because they already share so much in common with you, right? They don't have to reinvent the wheel. So they oftentimes smell like you. They kind of look like you. They probably have a lot of your ancestral genes are shared in common with this species. So they have to masquerade less in order to infiltrate your society than just the typical Joe Schmo species. Like, it would be much harder for a very distantly related species to suddenly pretend to be you through evolutionary terms and evolve at a high level of mimicry. So things like slave-making acorn ants depicted here. Slave-making ants are closely related species to many acorn ants in North America that have evolved to infiltrate the acorn ant societies and steal brood of the acorn ants. The slave makers then take those brood, they bring them back to the slave maker society where the brood develop and then begin to help take care of the slave makers. So the slave makers raid societies of these acorn ants. They acquire the brood develop, and then the brood become a slave workforce caring for the slave makers. And it's, as far as we can tell, under normal conditions, they have no idea that they're taking care of a totally different species. Mind you, more raids will happen from those slave makers, but they will no longer do it themselves. They'll have their sort of orphans they stole from other acorn ants go steal more brood, and then they generate a large workforce that is totally unrelated from a totally different species that just goes on taking care of these enslavers. And the enslavers are usually very closely related species. All right. The last thing is that social traits are not your own. So selection, oftentimes the trait that selection is favoring is not something you can do on your own. Even if you're a social species, even if you're two individuals that have a social phenotype, it can be hard for you to produce the phenotypes, the strategies that would really be favored, right? Because maybe it's some sort of coordinated attack that would be really advantageous for us. Or maybe it's when we have 20 individuals scanning the skies together, that's when it really has the payoff for us to be social and highly integrated. But until we reach that moment, until we have the right combination of other individuals around you, we can't even express that trait. So the phenotype that might be really advantageous from the perspective of evolution isn't something that you can control on your own. It's beyond you. And so you have to create circumstances, or evolution has to have drift create circumstances, or evolution has to create circumstances through natural selection that allow you to create those environments where you can execute your optimal or your most advantageous social phenotype. So a couple of ways that evolution can do this. One, social niche construction. Oftentimes, social individuals and social species have evolved habitat choice and social group choice traits that allow them to detect the environments where their phenotype would do best. So if you were one of these lemurs and you had a mutation that allowed you, or that you had a strategy that allowed you to be incredibly pro-social, normally in such species, evolution has also fostered the development of traits that allow individuals to find those sorts of environments. They might prefer to aggregate in large social groups and not go it alone because they have traits that would be particularly advantageous for them in large social groups. So social needs construction is basically that you will seek out and or create the social environment that serves you best. And so if that turns out to be an environment that has more individuals of your species, then there will tend to be the evolution of traits that cause individuals to select those kinds of environments. If, however, there's other kinds of individuals that have traits that tend to do better in low density environments and less social environments, then oftentimes they evolve social niche construction that allows them to find those kinds of environments and choose them. So it's basically habitat choice, where the habitat is the social environment that you're selecting. Do you want to go it alone? Do you want to go in this kind of group or that kind of group? Do you want to what kind of role do you assume within the group? What kind of position? This can the optimal social landscape for you might be contingent on your traits, and therefore we'd expect evolution to link those things together. The traits that are advantageous and the adaptation to make sure that you can find the circumstances where your adaptation is relevant and maximized by social needs construction. Social selection is just a big old term that which was a concept we've hit on a few times, but it's a term that I'll probably throw around later on. Anyway, social selection is basically the idea that the profitability of a trait depends on your social surroundings. If that is true, and it's oftentimes true, things like positive frequency dependent selection are a kind of social selection. Social niche construction is an outcome, a common outcome of social selection. If the profitability of your trait depends on your social circumstances, like big group, small group, one kind of group versus another kind of group, then we would anticipate social niche construction to evolve to make sure that you can find that optimal kind of group. Lastly, positive and negative frequency dependent selection. I already mentioned positive frequency dependent selection, which says that the more common your trait is in the environment, the better that trait is going to perform. Sociality in general, it's very common that the more common pro-social, altruistic, cooperative traits are in the population, the better that strategy tends to do. The opposite of that is negative frequency dependent selection, which is where the more common this strategy is in the population, the worse it does, which means that the rare phenotypes do best. And the classic example of that inside of animal societies are cheaters. Cheaters, if you're rare inside of a society, you're just such a low proportion of the total individuals, then odds are you're going to be hard to detect. Odds are that evolution is not going to have driven detection mechanisms or policing mechanisms to find you. But if parasites are very common, then suddenly that will cause the evolution of the host species to be able to detect you and throw you out. Worse, if there are many cheaters inside of a society, the society might not function at all. And so cheating, it pays to be rare. You must try to find circumstances where you are an uncommon phenotype, versus cooperation is usually positive frequency dependent. And that's it. So that's what we covered so far today, and or rather over the last several days. And coming up will be common methods of evaluating questions in social evolution, so experimental approaches, using natural variation to evaluate questions on the evolution of sociality, and common mathematical models. We'll talk about two of the most common mechanisms and frameworks for studying the evolution of altruism, but cooperation as well. Kin selection, which you're probably already familiar with, and multi-level selection, which you're probably less familiar with. And then lastly, we'll talk about common mathematical models that people use to evaluate hypotheses, concepts in sociality without necessarily having to run experiments. And so we'll cover things like basic game theory and common models like the haystack model to evaluate the evolution of sociality and cheaters and the conditions that could favor either one of those strategies. I hope that this actually recorded. And let me see if this actually recorded. We're going to stop sharing. Yes. Oh my God, it looks so pale. You can see my bad skin.